Next is the semantic cognitive model, meaning semantics, this is what Bloom suggested. Semantics precedes syntax in child language acquisition. Children develop syntax because they develop their grammar because they already have something to talk about. So they're already motivated. And it's for that reason rather than because they have grammar to use and they just want to use it. In other words, there has to be a motivating factor. I'm sorry, let me get to the right page here in my notes. Okay, so I have an example here. If a child said mommy sock and that's all you knew, you might guess what they're saying. But one way that they could be using it is telling you, hey, pointing at your sock and saying, mommy, sock. Like, hey, I know what that's called. That's your sock. They could also be saying, mommy, sock, and holding up their little sock to you, saying, mommy, put my sock on. So because if children are able to understand that this word has two meanings and use the word with two meanings, or use both meanings, then that suggests that semantics or vocabulary is going to actually precede grammar. Here's an example. I want you to think of how you can fill in this blank. So ask yourself a few questions here as we decide what goes in the blank. Who could actually fill in this blank? And at what age do you think they could? Now, I'm assuming by this point we all can think of something that goes in the blank, but how did you know what to put there? I'm going to say that one reason you know is because there's these syntactic rules that help us know it has to be a noun, because it wouldn't make sense to put another verb there. The jumping is swimming. So you already know in your mind, you most likely did not start coming up with this list of verbs. You most likely came up with this list of nouns. However, how did you know what you could not put there? Because it's not as simple as just using a noun, right? Because another noun could be library. The library is swimming, but that doesn't make sense. So there's also these semantic rules that are going to tell you, hey, only certain nouns can go here and make sense and other nouns can't. And so we know that vocabulary and meaning is highly important, but we also know that there is a syntactic rule that's being followed there as well. That's being used for you to narrow down what can go in that blank and make sense. Potential limitations of this theory are it gives little attention to the role of language input. It doesn't really suggest that adult input matters at all. But then how else could we account for differences in language correlating with language models? There's not evidence that language relies on cognitive development, although some cognitive development do appear at the same time. So we've talked about this. We talked about our cognitive basis of language, but the specific term for this would be bootstrapping. An example would be a child understands what the words all gone mean, what that phrase means. At the same time, they start to grasp object permanence, which would mean understanding that when something is out of view or all gone, it still exists. So there's not evidence necessarily that language relies on cognitive development. But we have to acknowledge that occasionally it happens and we can't say for sure why. Contributions of this model, it made us continue to look further just beyond syntax. It had a significant impact on intervention that we're going to talk about a little later. And like the others, it becomes a piece of this puzzle, but not the entire answer. This next one, the social interactionist model, it's stating that children learn to choose language based on what they need to get their point across in that situation. So people talk in order to communicate. So the emphasis is going to be on the communicative intent of language. Remembering that communication and language are not synonymous. Communication requires a sender and a receiver. And it requires shared meaning and all those things, shared intent. And so they're saying that through communicative acts is how language is formed. And it does place a great emphasis on environment, obviously, if it's saying that a communication interaction is required to develop language. So the role of social skills, which would come into an account, a pragmatic language, social language, which is needed to communicate. So this theory came about because they were studying social skills closer, and they realized how critical it was, and they started classifying these rules. And different disciplines even researched this, studying interactions between parents and children. And they discovered that languages that focus on what the child's attention is going toward, and focusing that language on what's critical in the moment and in the flow of language, that's how they learn. So parents modify speech. We tend to emphasize, or teachers of young children, we tend to emphasize certain parts or functions that are critical in the flow of language, right? And it's called scaffolding. But we're trying to do what makes sense to the child and still holds their attention. So, in that, children learn that their language can be used purposefully. We know if they see and experience language through play, it has natural reinforcement in the form of this social attention, whether that's from an adult or another child. They automatically are reinforced if they're in this communicative act and they're talking and the receiver is listening and responding. That's reinforcing. And then once they are motivated, they indirectly pick up a lot of other things. And I have seen this many times in my own practice, is once they learn the power of their communication in one setting, and I usually tried to focus on the setting that was most highly motivating to them. I didn't always have to teach language a lot past that. It was a lot of getting that language to start and begin. But then once they learned how powerful it was and reinforcing it was, they just took off. Another thing in this area is this idea of a usage-based model, meaning you have to continue to use it, and that's part of what makes it stick. It has to be used frequently to actually work, and it's just saying that these language forms that we've discussed, phonology, morphology, syntax, or grammar, emerge from using it. And as they interact with others, correct language results from all that practice, all those interactions. I definitely have seen this, and this is another reason that social and pragmatic skills, I will just really emphasize them every time I'm talking with you, is because this is yet not only just a quality of life and I believe ethical implication of giving people this opportunity for social human interaction. They need it to learn their language because it's such a powerful tool in reinforcing and learning new words and solidifying words they already know by practicing them, and they get the most in conversation. So when kids are not don't have the skills to be successful socially, that also automatically impacts their language, and language impacts their reading and their writing. So it's all connected in a very powerful way to pragmatic language, to social language. Limitations here, they have not said for sure what's the minimal amount of interaction a person needs to learn, or what's an optimal amount, meaning this amount of interaction equals this grade of language. And then this one, and even though it didn't set out to focus on it, it didn't focus on grammar or syntactic structures. So again, they're asking that question. Well, how does this model account for this way that all children seem to develop the sequence of language the same, even if their interaction levels are different? And then another important one that we've mentioned before, and why syntax is important, grammar is, because they're saying, if you're saying, okay, you're saying that's through communicative acts, but it's still through a lot of adult interaction, a lot of adult input. So why aren't they speaking like adults? Why don't they use great grammar, and why don't they use a large vocabulary if that's where they're learning language? And this is a good question. This one does have a significant influence on language intervention. It emphasizes using indirect methods of language versus breaking down language into small parts. And it stresses this idea of a wholeness of language and truly the essential role of communication in language learning.